Okay, so we have to switch to English now. I hope you can now understand me using the translator. So I will be talking about economies powered by, okay, it's better now, good. Economies powered by the Internet of Blockchain. So what does that mean? So we have heard that blockchain is not only cryptocurrencies, but that it actually can do a lot more things, and I will talk about a little bit of how I envision that world to look like in the next few years and what is the next wave of blockchain, so to say. A little bit on my background. I'm a software developer. I come from the web development world. I have been lucky enough to be part of the Ethereum Foundation since 2015, and I played a crucial role in helping with the things I built to bring Ethereum where it is today. I have built one of the first applications for the Ethereum blockchain, which is the Mist browser. The Mist browser was the first decentralized application browser, or we call it Web 3.0 browser. And I worked on tools that developers are using to build things on top of Ethereum. What I'm more known for now is ERC20. That's a standard I proposed back then in 2015 in November. And you probably have all heard about ICOs and tokens. Most of them are relying on that standard, which I proposed in 2015. I also proposed other standards about identity on the blockchain or on-chain profiles and other things, and have been kind of part of that world since the last 4 years, deeply. So when we think about blockchain, everybody probably have heard about Bitcoin. And Bitcoin started in 2009, and it allowed us to actually have, for the first time, global economies and global value transfer without a middleman. And this itself is a complete novum. I mean, this is something the banking infrastructure of the world, even though we have systems like SWIFT and SEPA and so on, couldn't really achieve. That's the first time that we have a global economy based on a common infrastructure. And it introduced also this concept of decentralization, which allows trustless economic exchanges. In 2015, this whole technology, in a way, got upgraded with the Ethereum blockchain. The Ethereum blockchain, proposed by a white paper from Vitalik Buterin, back then he was 21, I think, allowed not only to exchange value around the blockchain, but it allowed to program something called smart contracts. And I know this term is very confusing because smart contracts are not smart and they are maybe not even contracts. In fact, smart contracts are little programs that you can install on this blockchain or on a blockchain. And these programs have the same properties like Bitcoin has. This means it is a global, verifiable infrastructure, means whatever you install there, whatever you interact with, you can verify. And therefore, you know whatever you do there works the way it's supposed to. That's very different with a centralized infrastructure, because here we have to trust the middleman. We have to trust the clearinghouse. We have to trust the company running the infrastructure. And today we achieve this by having a lot of regulation and a lot of laws and a lot of repercussion if they don't do as such. But it's very slow. Change is very hard to do because you have to involve a lot of parties and it takes very long. One thing what the Ethereum blockchain and smart contracts allow is something called composability. And composability means that the smart contracts I'm building, the logic I'm building, like be it a token or be it a land title registry, how we had heard before, or be it anything else which exchanges value, can be built on top of. This means I can have other systems that are building on top of my systems, purely based on standards, for example, as one, or purely because they want to. So it's an open economical infrastructure where everybody can build building blocks, and these building blocks can interact. And that's one of the reasons why we have seen such an explosion around tokens on Ethereum. In fact, Ethereum itself is 86% of all blockchain developers, or roughly, are building on either Ethereum, the network, or Ethereum-related technologies. It is the de facto standard in the blockchain space when it comes around programmable blockchains, so smart contract-based blockchains. And in the ideal scenario of the blockchain perspective, or the blockchain developers' perspective, we all would like to have one blockchain to rule them all. If we look at the activity, and this is just showing the Ethereum's spread of use. So it has the most core developers on its blockchain itself, and it actually 2 years ago surpassed Bitcoin in transaction volume. So everybody knows Bitcoin, not everybody knows Ethereum, but Ethereum is the most active chain in the world right now. And we all would like to have this one blockchain to rule them all. So we would like to have one super blockchain we all can build on top of. Because if we can do that, we can create a lot of economic value of a lot of things being able to interact with each other, where we not only can transfer value, but we also can transfer data or economic interactions. Be it, for example, a land title registry or a tokenized building. So chopping a building off in little pieces that you can distribute between different stakeholders and things like this. The problem with that is, realistically speaking, that's not happening anytime soon. As much as we would like to have one blockchain and use all the same blockchain, it's not going to happen anytime soon because blockchains are not unlimited scalable. So we don't have unlimited resources to run on one single blockchain. Therefore, I propose the idea of an internet of blockchains. So rather than thinking we need one blockchain, let's think of we use one common protocol. And the most common protocol so far we have in the blockchain space is the so-called Ethereum virtual machine, or WebAssembly, which is something very similar. So most smart contracts today run in the EVM, though they're not all running on Ethereum, the network. There are also other Ethereum protocol-based networks. And the Internet of Blockchain, as I see it happening in the next, let's say, 3, 4, 5 years, is actually an internet of blockchains running similar protocols, but having dedicated networks for dedicated communities or dedicated industries. And maybe I have to talk very shortly about the difference between permissionless and permissioned blockchains, or public and private blockchains. Currently, if we think about the enterprise world, most people think about private blockchains. So they think about, okay, we do something with blockchain, so let's start our own, right? That is only useful to some degree, because when you're talking about blockchain, you want to have a lot of untrusted parties that interact with each other. That's exactly where blockchain is the strongest. If we are having this within one company, then everybody already trusts each other to some degree. It could be interesting in a very large company where you have a lot of departments, and therefore you need to align these departments. But ideally, you want to have a lot of players, a lot of different players. There are reasons to build consortium chains, so private chains between different enterprises. But for the most reason and the most powerful and the most successful blockchains will be the public blockchains. This means these are blockchains driven by the public community, be it many companies, many developers, or even users, and which are publicly verifiable. And those kind of blockchains allow that anybody can build and join and build on top of those blockchains so-called DApps, or decentralized applications. And we have seen a lot of applications on Ethereum, for example. Many go in the direction of DeFi, or decentralized finance, as you can see there. Or, for example, so-called DAOs, which is decentralized autonomous organizations. So Ethereum is very much around trying cutting-edge decentralization, and how do you build in this new Web 3.0 world. But there are other blockchains. One is LUKSO. That's a blockchain we will start next year. That's the project I'm working on since more than a year. This is a blockchain for the fashion and lifestyle world. There are also other blockchains around the energy industry. For example, we have the Energy Web Foundation, which has a blockchain where almost all global energy providers in some form or another already joined. There are blockchains around sustainability, or blockchain around data marketplaces like the Ocean Protocol here. So we actually already see this new wave of dedicated blockchains for specific purposes or specific communities. But in the core, they all functions the same. So they're all using either the WebAssembly machine or the Ethereum virtual machine. So they use the same core where you execute the code in. This means when I am a developer building something on a smart contract blockchain, I can likely deploy it to any of those blockchains. But I will obviously choose the one where I have the highest synergies, where it's fitting to my business. And those public blockchains, is what we also heard before, are creating actually the next wave of big value concentration. And they are not platforms, but those are ecosystems. And with ecosystems, we already have seen it with Bitcoin, we have seen it with Ethereum. They function more like digital nation states, where a lot of value is accumulated in a common infrastructure run by the commons. And why do we want to have separate blockchains? Or maybe just one point more. Those blockchains are not isolated. You can actually connect those blockchains either directly or through something called umbrella networks. So for example, Polkadot or the Cosmos network, they are building so-called umbrella networks. They are only there to let messages being transferred from one blockchain to another, so that you have an internet of blockchains which runs pretty much automated. The reason why we want to have separate networks, and the main reason actually, is scalability. Blockchains are not 100% super scalable. They do have a limit of transactions per second. So in order to use blockchain today in mainstream use cases and in the public, we do need multiple networks. If we look at the Ethereum network, this is the gas usage. This means this is the activity on the network. And since basically 2017, it's almost at 80–90% of its capacity. Bitcoin is the same. Bitcoin is almost at its capacity since 2 years. This means we do need to spread over many more blockchains. The other benefit is community, and are the synergies that are created if you have common interest, parties, businesses, and users on a common blockchain. Because of, obviously, standards like the ERC20 token standard that I proposed in November 2017, we have seen an economy actually created around $40 billion at its peak, purely because everybody is using the same standardized token smart contract. And standards doesn't mean here defining in detail the logic. Standards means that we agree on a subset of interfaces. So how do I talk to a token? How can I transfer a token? How can I request the balance? But under the hood, every token can function differently. Every token can do something differently. It could be a security. It could be a tokenized house. It could be a technical functionality. It could open doors. It could be an object. All of those things are possible while still being functional and interoperable with basically all the wallets out there, all the exchanges out there, and so on. This is what led to this explosion we have seen, and we have, I guess, like 2,000 or 3,000 or whatever tokens, where 90% of them are built on the Ethereum network today, and they have created a humongous concentration of value. Some tokens are even up to 10% of the Ethereum network itself. I mean, I think Binance is $1 billion or so, or it's like 5% or so. So on the other hand, and this is actually very important to understand, every blockchain that runs in a public setting and has no single party to run it requires a cryptocurrency. So a cryptocurrency is not there for people to have a new money. It is actually required to run a decentralized infrastructure. If you would take out Ether from the Ethereum network, the network would stop functioning immediately because there's no incentive anymore for anybody to run and secure this blockchain. So the cryptocurrency and the limited supply of this cryptocurrency is its security. It is what makes miners mine and makes users need to pay for transaction, and therefore they cannot spam the network. So the security is super important. So if we have different blockchains or ecosystems per industry or per community or per different purposes, we allow that value creation and that value capture through that network's cryptocurrency and allow different type of base assets that are required to run this economy and this economy. So the ecosystem's cryptocurrency is actually very important, and it not only captures the value and brings everybody around their own blockchain, but it actually benefits everybody across the board. So there's not a single group which benefits and everybody else gets a tool, but everybody benefits and everybody gets a tool. That's very different of how platforms work today. If we think of Amazon, Amazon gets the money, everybody else has a marketplace. In a blockchain, technically everybody gets the value increase, and everybody else has also other things you can build on top of. So it's very different in that sense. And we have that seen in basically every blockchain so far, even the smaller ones. And these increases do go very high, so they can be sometimes 100 or 1,000 times higher than the initial few years value. And the last part of why you want to have a separate blockchain ecosystem is because you can incentivize every stakeholder along the growth path of this ecosystem. So if we would build on one single blockchain, uniting a new community around a common blockchain is very hard, because you want to incentivize them to join this new ecosystem, to build applications in the, for example, let's say when we talk about LUKSO, and this is the distribution of LUKSO, it's hard to get new players in and tell them, hey, build here, build these things. But if you have a common infrastructure and you're able to distribute basically the shares of that network so that everybody, the early comers and the late comers, feel they are a part of that network equally, then you can create growth and you can create traction around this ecosystem. So it is a key piece as well. We do have to understand, very important, that the cryptocurrencies of these blockchains don't give you any right like a company share. So they're not a security because they don't give you voting right or anything. The only thing you can do with this cryptocurrency is use the network. And this use is not dependent on one single entity. It's dependent on a lot of random validators. So it's more like an exchange. It's an economic exchange. It's not a service from one party to the other. And that makes it very complicated in the understanding because it's very differently run. It's more close to an economy of a country than it is to a company. And that's the learnings we need to do. That was my presentation. That was all I had to say today, but we have more to talk in the panel, and feel free to ask questions then later.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Pu. I'm the founder of Taraxa, and it's really an honor to be part of this symposium today. So I'm here today to talk a bit about how blockchain technology can be leveraged in industrial uses, and specifically how it can enable devices, connected devices, to become much more valuable and much more useful. Okay. So in the book, Next Blockchain, we actually go through a very long litany of different challenges in the blockchain, in the IoT ecosystem, which we believe that blockchain is actually well suited to address. But here, today, we're just going to talk about two very short pain points. One short-term pain point, one long-term pain point, all right? The short-term pain point today is that as the number of connected devices increase, and as they become increasingly more embedded in our daily lives and in our daily businesses, we see that many business models are increasingly coming to rely upon trusting the data that connected devices produce. So if you're unable to trust that data, a lot of business models simply cannot succeed. So that's the short-term problem. The longer-term problem is that as the number of autonomous devices increase and scale, we're going to run into problems with scalability as well as security if we stick with today's centralized governance structure. I will give examples of both use cases in my talk about applications. So what can blockchain do for IoT devices, right? So blockchain can give IoT devices unique identities. So today, devices don't really have identities. They have identities insofar as the manufacturers know that they have identities. IoT is not an industry. It is millions and millions of little fragmented silos, okay? So there is no such thing as an IoT industry. It's just millions of little industries. They're not connected, and identities are not shared across these silos. So blockchain has the potential of being able to give them an identity just like us people have identities. The second thing is that it allows IoT devices to own assets, to actually have the concept of asset ownership and be able to actually transact. So this is a critical capability required for devices if they are able to make economic decisions going forward. So what's an example of an economic decision? So today, devices are very smart in making localized inferences, right? Is this a rock or is this a cat, right? But when it comes to an economic decision, such as my battery is running out, I need a software upgrade, someone needs to fix me, these are not decisions that devices are able to make. And in order for autonomous device ecosystems to scale and become more secure, they need to have the capability of making these decisions. And of course, the culmination of these properties make devices very independent and self-reliant. So this is going to look great for our future. You know, we see these robots flying around in science fiction movies. This is going to enable that. Okay. So Taraxa fundamentally is a public ledger, public blockchain. I'm not going to talk too much about the technology. We took time to build a public ledger because we see that today the blockchain space has a very immature infrastructural technology. So in order to be successful in building applications, our team needs to have the capability to design, to implement, to modify the underlying infrastructural technology to adapt to its application needs. So that's why we created the Taraxa ledger. We just released our testnet last week, I think. So if you want to check out the technology some more, feel free to join our Discord channel. And once again, we're very, very deeply honored to have had involvement in publishing this book, The Next Blockchain. Okay, so before I delve into some of the applications that we're working on, I want to say a few things, several prefaces. The first thing is that I believe that decentralized systems, such as blockchain systems, are not here to replace centralized systems, right? I think they're here to make centralized systems more efficient, and most importantly, they're here to make sure that centralized systems are honest, that they cannot cheat, they cannot monopolize, and that they're very secure, okay? So decentralized systems help make centralized systems better. Okay? The second thing is that, as a preface, what I will talk about is a variety of archetypical business models or problems that we believe that blockchain can solve today, right? So another struggle that everyone in the blockchain space has today is, what is blockchain used for? What can blockchain be used for? What kind of problems can blockchain solve? And a lot of enthusiasts and evangelists, I think, in the space often talk about the problems that blockchain can solve 20 years from now or 50 years from now. Right? So we're very interested in the problems that blockchain can solve today. Okay. So here are a few archetypical examples of what we're doing. And all these examples are in Japan, by the way. So this is, in my opinion, the best market to actually deploy blockchain applications because of its regulatory clarity. The first one is trusted devices enabling fair business models. So we're working with a very interesting business. We're working with an arcade renting business. So they rented a lot of arcade machines here in Japan, and they work on a business model of profit sharing. So however much money the lessor makes on a specific machine, they will split it with the lessor. Okay, very simple business model. Works great in Japan because the customers just report very honestly, exactly how much money each machine made. So as this company expands overseas, they find out that not everyone else in the world is so honest, right? They don't necessarily report accurate numbers on how much money the machine is making. So this creates a lot of problems for this company. So because now they have no way of knowing exactly how much money these machines are making. So they have two options. Number one, don't expand overseas. Not a great option. Second option, go away from a profit sharing model into a fixed fee model, right? And a fixed fee model, as we all know, is not the most economically efficient model because at any given moment, one party is unhappy with this model, right? Set too low, the lessor is unhappy. Set too high, the lessee is unhappy. So what can we do, right? So we built a wireless module that gets plugged into these machines that reports back how much each machine is actually being run, or how much money each machine is earning. Reports it back, sends it into the cloud, right? No blockchain at all. What's the problem? The problem is that once this data is being stored in the cloud, and the lessor shows this data to his distributors, to his partners, to his customers, and say, here's how much money this machine has made. You know what the partners are going to say? They're going to say, where did this data come from? I don't trust this data, right? Where did you get it? Did you just make it up, right? Just at your home, on your laptop, made up these numbers. So what we do is that as the data is being generated on the machine, we also upload it into the cloud. At the source of this data generation, we also anchor this data onto the blockchain, which is a process of hashing, adding metadata, and putting a cryptographic signature on it. So what this process does is that it guarantees two things. Number one, this data came from this specific machine because of the cryptographic signature. Second, after this data was created, it was not tampered with. It was immutable. It hasn't been changed, right? So this establishes a basis of trust between the lessor and its overseas partners and customers so that they can have a foundation, based upon which to build a fair business model, which is a profit-sharing business model, right? Without which there will always be arguments about, can I trust this data? Do I know where it came from? Similar business models can also be used in other projects. We're also pursuing an infrastructural monitoring project that uses a similar idea where there are many, many stakeholders, government regulators, operators, as well as financial institutions with conflicting financial interests who all want to make their decisions based on a set of sensor readings off of these public infrastructures. Okay. All right. The second one, open standards to encourage collaboration. So this is actually a very, very interesting problem, right? So as technology becomes more complex, we see that projects become more complex, and when the world becomes more globalized, you're not really just working with 2 companies in your own country, you're probably working with 2,000 companies across the entire world, right? So as the supply chain, the partnerships, the business models, and the technology become more complex, you're dealing with a much more complex web of entities. So how do you make sure you coordinate the flow of information, right? So option number 1, the centralized option, is that somebody will build a ERP system and force everybody along the supply chain to get on this ERP system, right? You either get on it or you don't do business with it, right? That might have worked 10, 20 years later, before, but today there's a very good chance that most of your suppliers do business with not just you. They do business with 100 other customers. So is every supplier going to really install 100 different systems? No, right? So you end up with a very, very large problem that's actually not well addressed by current centralized solutions. So what do? Instead of developing a proprietary standard and forcing everyone else to get on this standard, you develop an open standard that's vaguely defined. It doesn't have to be tightly defined, it has to be vaguely defined. It defines your own interface, input and output, and it gives suggestions on the rest of the supply chain and what type of data they might actually output. The problem that everyone faces in the supply chain is not faced by a single entity on the supply chain. It's faced by every single entity on the supply chain. So instead of having one very large, difficult to solve problem, which is creating a centralized piece of software and forcing everyone to get on it, you actually turn that one large, hard problem into many, many smaller, easier problems, which is that every single person, every single entity around this ecosystem can decide to develop their own data standards and anchor them into the blockchain, right? And since blockchain has data immutability and data provenance guarantees, you can be sure that it is the right entity anchoring the right information into the system. And what about all those incompatible data standards? Well, the pressure will no longer come from a single entity on the supply chain. The pressure will actually come collectively between every single entity that's working with these other entities, right? So this turns, once again, blockchain helps you turn a very large, difficult to solve problem into a much easier to solve, larger number of smaller problems. And that's the power of an open standard. Okay. Blockchain can also help to democratize data. All right. So we're working with a large automotive OEM to actually build a proof of concept on democratizing mobility data, right? So why are we exploring this? Why is this something that's important that we explore today? We have lots of centralized data-driven business models today, right? Where someone collects a lot of data and they resell it or develop solutions on top of it. But at the same time, we see a lot of regulatory pressure and public sentiment, right? So there's been a lot of data leaks, there's been a lot of security breaches, and there are regulations all across the world that are saying, hey, maybe aggregating data is not such a good way of doing business. Maybe consumer and personal privacy need to be protected. Many centralized data aggregation business models work very well today, but they might not work well in the future. 10 years, 15 years later, they might be illegal in many parts of the world. So this is interesting to explore for companies who are heavily reliant, and heavily invested into data aggregation business models. We might need to think about how we can make our business models more future-proof, right, for the next generation. And the last example is what I call cooperation, which is collaboration between competitors. Okay. For this, we're actually working with one of the largest parking lot operators here in Japan, actually. This is very interesting. So one of the things that we've seen, which is, this is very curious, is that the parking lot management business is very fragmented, right? There are many, many, many players managing, all kinds of parking lots. So this management business is a two-sided market, right? So on the supply side, as someone who has inventory in parking lot, they would like to list their inventory on as many markets as possible to maximize the chances of their inventory being leased and to maximize their profits. But they cannot do that, right? Because if they list on multiple markets, then what happens is that when it gets rented on one, it's not synchronized with the other one. So you get conflicts. How do you solve this? Well, the centralized solution is that someone creates a platform and goes to all these competitors and say, how about every one of you synchronize your data with me? Someone has tried that. It doesn't work because nobody is stupid, right? No one is going to give all your data to a centralized player because then they own you, right? So that's not good. So it doesn't happen, right? The market doesn't consolidate. On the side of consumers, we're talking about double-sided market here. We talked about the supply side. On the demand side, on the side of drivers, is a driver really going to install 30 applications on their phone, right? 30 apps, right? Just so that they can go around and park, right? They're not going to do that. They're not going to install 30 apps. It's very inconvenient, okay? So we have a situation where you have a group of competitors who refuse to collaborate, which creates fundamentally a worse experience for both the supply side as well as the demand side of the market, right? So what can we do? Well, how can blockchain help? Well, what we can do is that we can deploy parking sensors into these parking places, which in the short term, actually with data analytics, it's nothing to do with blockchain, help them to increase their return on their asset. But once those sensors are placed on these parking lots, we can actually track which parking lot is occupied by whom, for how long, and when, right? So now that data can be anchored, once again, onto the blockchain. And why would these competitors be okay with this, right? Because now there is no centralized player to threaten their business anymore, right? There is no centralized platform. There is no centralized business there to try to threaten them. They can join anytime they want. They can quit anytime they want. Blockchain is open source. They can fork a copy of the entire system and run it on their own. They can do whatever they want, right? So what we have now is a much safer way, a very safe way for competitors to actually collaborate, collectively creating a much better experience, much better user experience for both the demand side and the supply side of these two-sided markets. So as we sort of progress through the technology, as we progress through the markets, we are continuously looking for archetypical business models where we can address problems that exist today with blockchain technology. I won't take any time to talk about the technology because I think my time is up, but I would love to talk with you. Any of you have questions, if you want to challenge my views, I welcome you to come up and find me later after this conference. Thank you very much.